A widowed millionaire worth 80 million fired 19 nannies. But the 20th one changed everything and transformed his and his children's lives forever. Hello friends, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. The Murumbai mansion loomed against the fading light of Sao Paulo's dusk, its walls a monument of wealth and silence. From the outside, the property radiated power, wrought iron gates polished daily, hedges trimmed with surgical precision, and cameras discreetly hidden within marble statues that lined the driveway. Inside, however, the atmosphere resembled a mausoleum more than a home. Every corridor gleamed with marble floors. Every chandelier hung heavy with crystal, and yet the vastness only amplified the emptiness within. Edward Mason sat at the head of the 12-seat dining table, a solitary figure draped in tailored black. At 42, he looked every bit the tycoon the business press hailed him to be. Sharp lines in his suit, sharper lines in his jaw. His empire of supermarkets across the southeast had made him one of Brazil's wealthiest men, with a fortune estimated at 80 million reais. But this evening, like every evening for the past 3.5 years, his fortune could not purchase the only thing missing: warmth. Michael, 8 years old, sat to Edward's left, stiff-backed and grave, like a soldier rehearsing adulthood. He did not speak unless directly asked, and even then his responses rarely exceeded a word. On Edward's right was Sophia, 6, her small hands folded carefully beside her plate. Her wide eyes darted from father to brother, but her lips remained sealed, as though speech itself had been banished from her body. With strangers, she spoke nothing at all, a condition the pediatrician had termed selective mutism. At the dinner table, with her father near, it seemed she had chosen mutism entirely. The silverware clinked against porcelain, the only sound echoing through the cavernous dining room. A three-course meal prepared by the chef waited to be tasted, but no one seemed eager. Edward forced himself through a few bites, conscious of his children's untouched plates. He cleared his throat. "Michael," he said, "how was school today?" Michael shrugged, eyes fixed on the pattern of his napkin. "Nothing unusual," he murmured. "And you, Sophia?" The little girl blinked at him, lips pressed together, then looked down, her silence forming a wall higher than any he could scale. Edward exhaled sharply. Another dinner wasted in strained silence. At the far end of the room, nearly hidden in shadow, stood Mrs. Constance. At 58, the housekeeper had grown into something far more than a servant. She was the silent witness to the family's unraveling, a caretaker of ghosts. She had been with the Masons for over 12 years, back when Helen was alive and the halls resounded with laughter. Now, she guarded her words, speaking only when Edward allowed, but her eyes brimmed with concern as she watched father and children sink deeper into solitude. Dinner ended as it always did, plates half full, conversation absent, and the three family members retreating to separate quarters. Edward disappeared into his study, a cavernous room lined with legal tomes, market reports, and a grand piano covered in dust. Michael climbed the staircase alone, a school bag heavy with assignments he would complete without guidance. Sophia shuffled to her room, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her silence more eloquent than any scream. Later that night, Edward poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at the portrait above the mantelpiece. Helen, frozen in oil paint, smiled with the vitality that had once defined their lives. 3.5 years had passed since the accident on the Bandaranes highway, a sudden rain, a truck that lost control, and his world shattered in twisted steel. Edward had buried her, and with her, he thought, all capacity to feel. Since then, 19 nannies had entered and exited this mansion. Each arrived with credentials, recommendations, and spotless resumes. Each left within weeks. Edward had found fault in all. Too lenient, too strict, too cheerful, too cold. One had spoken Portuguese with an accent he disliked. Another had dared to suggest family therapy. None survived his scrutiny. With every dismissal, Michael's eyes hardened further and Sophia's silence deepened. Edward told himself he was protecting his children, but in truth, he was protecting his own grief, unwilling to let anyone else near it. That night, as the whiskey burned down his throat, Mrs. Constance entered quietly. She carried a tray of untouched fruit, her steps deliberate. "Sir," she said softly, "may I speak freely?" Edward did not look away from Helen's portrait. Go on. These children need more than order and schedules, she said. They need a heart beside them. Not another nanny from an agency. Not another professional with diplomas framed in gold. They need someone who can see them and stay. Edward turned sharply. Are you suggesting I haven't provided for them? You've provided everything money can buy, she replied evenly. But not everything they need. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. She placed a folded paper on the desk, a name written in neat ink, Beatrice Collins. She has no degree, no certificates that would impress you, Mrs. Constance continued. But she raised her daughter alone after losing her husband. She looked after children in our church for years. Anthony Rogers at the bakery entrusted his sons to her, and they flourished. She is steady, gentle. Not a resume, Mr. Mason. A heart. Edward frowned, unwilling to entertain the suggestion. A caretaker without credentials? It sounded absurd, but Mrs. Constance did not withdraw her gaze. Consider meeting her, she urged. Not for your sake, for theirs. Her eyes flicked toward the staircase, where two small figures lay in cold beds. Edward dismissed her with a wave, yet when he was alone again, he found himself tracing the letters of the name, Beatrice Collins. Something stirred, a faint echo of a possibility he did not dare name. The mansion fell into silence once more, but beneath its polished floors, the first fracture had formed, the kind of fracture that, given time, could break open the walls of grief. The following morning began with the predictable rhythm of the Mason household. Silence draped over polished floors, servants moving like ghosts, and Edward disappearing into the day with his driver waiting by the iron gates. Yet beneath the surface of this controlled existence, something trembled. The slip of paper with Beatrice Collins's name remained on Edward's desk, and despite his refusal to acknowledge it, he had read it more than once before leaving for the office. In his absence, Mrs. Constance went about her duties, polishing silver and arranging flowers, but her mind remained fixed on the children. Michael had retreated into his fortress of seriousness. He rarely played anymore, only reading books that made him appear older than his years. Sophia had begun drawing on her sketchpad in silence, strange, haunting drawings of empty chairs and shadowed figures. The house itself seemed to echo these children's grief, every corner whispering reminders of Helen's absence. That afternoon, Michael found himself in the music room. Dust lay thick over the piano lid, and the air carried the faint scent of wax and wood polish. He lifted the cover tentatively, pressing a single key. The note reverberated with surprising clarity, stirring a memory he had tried to suppress. His mother's hands dancing across the keys, her voice humming softly as she urged him to join. He had once sat beside her, tapping clumsy notes while she laughed. That laughter seemed impossibly far away now. Sophia entered the room quietly, clutching her rabbit. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her gaze fixed on her brother's hesitant fingers. She did not speak, but her presence was enough. Michael lowered the lid, unable to bear the reminder, and walked out, leaving his sister alone with the instrument. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Edward returned earlier than usual that evening. He removed his tie and poured himself a drink. Yet the sight of Helen's untouched wardrobe across the room unsettled him. For 3 years, he had forbidden anyone to move her clothes. Dresses hung in neat rows, shoes aligned as if awaiting her return. He opened the wardrobe door and inhaled faint traces of her perfume, lavender and something floral, fading but stubborn. His mind slipped back to the night of the accident. Rain hammering the windshield. Helen's laughter moments before the screech of tires. The deafening silence after the crash. Edward clenched his fists, forcing the memory away. He had promised himself he would never revisit that night, but grief had a way of clawing back when least expected. Later, in the study, Mrs. Constance entered again, bold in her concern. "You're drifting further from them," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. Edward glared. "And what do you suggest I do? Open my heart to another stranger, only to see them fail again?" "This is not about strangers," she countered. "This is about facing the past. You hold on to Helen's absence so tightly that you leave no room for presence. Beatrice can help, not because she replaces Helen, but because she honors her by giving Michael and Sophia the stability they crave." Edward's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, but her words struck deep. That night, As the house slumbered, he sat in the study staring at Helen's photograph. He traced the outline of her face with his eyes and whispered, almost against his will, "What do I do now?" The silence answered him, yet the slip of paper remained within reach. By the end of the week, Edward relented. He had called Beatrice Collins, though his tone had been curt, professional, as though summoning an employee for an interview rather than inviting a woman into the sanctuary of his home. She arrived on a Saturday morning, escorted by Mrs. Constance, wearing a simple navy dress and carrying no folder, no certificates, no impressive binder of references. Her only accompaniment was a calm expression and eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and strength. Michael watched from the staircase, his expression wary. Sophia clung to the banister, half hidden, her rabbit pressed tightly to her chest. Neither child spoke. Edward greeted Beatrice in the drawing room, arms crossed, posture rigid. "You understand this is only an evaluation," he said. "I've dismissed 19 nannies in the past 3 years. Don't expect permanence." Beatrice nodded, unruffled. "I'm not here to impress you with permanence, Mr. Mason. I'm here to stay consistent, whether you choose me or not." Her voice held no arrogance, only conviction. She glanced at the children on the staircase, then back at Edward. "May I ask a favor before we continue?" Edward arched a brow. "What favor?" "May I see a photograph of Helen?" The question startled him. No nanny had dared mention Helen by name before. Edward hesitated, feeling his chest tighten. "Why?" "Because if I am to stand in this house, I want to honor the woman who built it with you," Beatrice said. "Your children loved her. They will not accept me if I pretend she never existed. I cannot erase her shadow, nor should I." Her words unsettled him more than any polished resume ever had. Slowly, he turned toward the mantel and lifted the framed portrait. He handed it to her, his hand trembling slightly. Beatrice held the photograph carefully, her eyes softening. "She was beautiful," she whispered, "and I imagine her heart was even greater. If I'm given the chance, I won't replace her. I'll only add another kind of love beside hers." Edward swallowed, feeling something stir he had long suppressed. Michael descended one step, curious despite himself, while Sophia peeked fully into view, her eyes wide. The interview stretched into conversation. Beatrice did not list credentials. She told stories of raising her daughter Julia alone after Robert's sudden death, of baking bread at the Rogers Bakery while caring for 3 small boys, of nights spent soothing children through fevers and fears. She spoke with honesty, not embellishment, and Edward found himself listening in spite of his resistance. When the meeting ended, Edward remained unsettled. He dismissed her politely, yet her words lingered long after she had gone. That evening, he stood at the dining table once more, staring at his children's downcast faces, and the thought pressed hard. Perhaps Mrs. Constance was right. Perhaps what they needed was not another professional, but someone who could see them. For the first time in years, Edward considered opening the locked door of his grief. And for the first time, his children dared to hope. Sunday morning light poured into the Mason mansion, filtering through high glass windows that had witnessed too many silent breakfasts. On this morning, however, the air carried something different, anticipation. Edward had called Beatrice back, against his instinct, under the guise of a trial period. He told himself it was temporary, another experiment, but part of him already knew he had crossed a line. Beatrice arrived promptly, her hands free, her demeanor calm. She entered the kitchen, not the drawing room, and immediately rolled up her sleeves. Without waiting for instructions, she asked Mrs. Constance for flour, sugar, and yeast. The older woman obliged, a knowing smile flickering on her face. By the time Michael and Sophia wandered into the kitchen, Beatrice's hands were coated in flour. The scent of dough baking in the oven drifted through the air. Michael frowned, skeptical. Sophia tilted her head, intrigued. "What are you making?" Michael asked, his voice defensive, as if preparing to reject whatever answer came. "Pâte à cucar," Beatrice replied. "Do you know it?" Michael froze. His eyes darted toward Edward, who had entered quietly, observing. Helen used to make that bread on special mornings, sweet and soft, sprinkled with sugar that melted into golden crusts. It had been years since the children had tasted it. "Your mother loved this recipe," Beatrice continued softly. "I don't know if I can make it as well as she did, but I thought we could try." The oven timer rang. She pulled out the tray, releasing the aroma that seemed to collapse time. Michael's jaw clenched. Tears welled up unexpectedly in his eyes. He turned away quickly, ashamed. Sophia, still silent, approached the counter, staring at the bread as if it were an artifact of magic. Beatrice sliced a piece and offered it to her. Sophia took it, her small hands trembling. She bit, and for the first time in months, her lips parted in something that resembled a smile. Edward caught his breath, overwhelmed by the sight. Michael finally gave in, grabbing a slice and chewing furiously, as though angry at the emotions threatening to break through. His tears spilled anyway. He slammed the bread down, his shoulders shaking. "Why did you do this?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Beatrice knelt to his level, her tone gentle. "Because memories are not enemies, Michael. They're bridges. You don't have to hide from them." Edward stood rooted, guilt crashing into him. He had locked Helen's memory away, thinking silence would protect the children. But this woman had just torn open that silence with a loaf of bread. And it had worked. Later, as the family sat at the long dining table, something shifted. Conversation trickled, hesitant, but real. Michael asked if Beatrice's daughter liked the bread too. Sophia pointed at the sugar crystals and whispered, for the first time to someone new, "Pretty." The sound of her small voice was like music in the cavernous room. Edward cleared his throat, struggling. "I owe you both an apology," he said, looking at his children. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping things orderly. But I've been wrong. I've failed you." Michael blinked, stunned at the admission. Sophia leaned against her father's arm, her silence transformed into closeness. Beatrice said nothing, but in her eyes, Edward saw recognition. The twist had come not from her credentials, but from her courage to honor Helen openly. As weeks unfolded, the rhythm of the mansion began to change. Beatrice did not arrive each day as an employee clocking in, but as a presence that blended into the household. She accompanied the children to school drop-offs, prepared meals that smelled of comfort rather than performance, and introduced small rituals, storytelling before bed, walks in the garden after homework, prayers whispered in the evening. Michael resisted at first. His mistrust of caregivers ran deep, but he could not deny the steadiness with which Beatrice remained. She did not flinch at his sullen moods, nor did she retreat when he snapped in frustration. One afternoon, when he pushed his plate away, muttering that nothing tasted right anymore, Beatrice simply placed the plate back in front of him. "Eat when you're ready," she said. "I'll be here." The simple words unsettled him. Nannies before had either coddled him or scolded him. Beatrice neither demanded nor withdrew. She stayed. Sophia, on the other hand, grew more open by the day. She began to tug on Beatrice's hand during walks, whispering small sentences only she could hear. At bedtime, she allowed Beatrice to read stories, her eyes shining with unspoken trust. Edward noticed, with quiet awe, how his daughter's silence cracked little by little. Yet not all alliances were seamless. The staff of the mansion had grown used to Edward's severity. Some regarded Beatrice with suspicion, convinced she would soon be dismissed like all the others. Whispers spread among the maids about her lack of qualifications. One cook muttered that Edward would never lower himself to keep someone without credentials. Beatrice overheard such whispers once, in the pantry. She did not retaliate. Instead, she smiled faintly and returned to her duties, proving with consistency what words could not. One evening, after the children were asleep, Edward found himself in the garden where Beatrice lingered. The night air was heavy with the scent of jasmine, and the lights of Sao Paulo glittered in the distance. "You've managed what 19 others could not," he said quietly. Beatrice looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I was only trying to be myself." Edward hesitated. "The children are changing. For the better." He paused, then added, "I didn't think it was possible." "Love makes impossible things possible," she replied. For a moment, their eyes locked, the air thick with unspoken tension. Edward looked away quickly, retreating to the safety of distance. He was not ready to confront what flickered between them. Inside, Mrs. Constance observed from the shadows of the corridor. She had prayed for this, for cracks in Edward's icy armor. Yet she also knew the path ahead would not be free of storms. The alliances within the house were shifting, but so were the divisions. And in that delicate balance, the Mason family began its slow rebirth. The first signs of spring in Sao Paulo softened the mansion's cold edges. Trees around the property bloomed faintly, and sunlight lingered longer on the marble floors. Inside, however, the atmosphere carried the same mix of fragility and renewal that had begun with Beatrice's arrival. Michael no longer sat silently through every dinner. He asked questions, even if awkwardly. Sophia, though still shy, began to utter full sentences in Beatrice's presence. Small victories blossomed each day, subtle yet profound. But with progress came new tensions, buried truths rising to the surface like seeds breaking through hardened soil. One evening, as Beatrice tucked Sophia into bed, the little girl whispered something that stopped her cold. "Sometimes I think Mommy is mad at me," Sophia murmured. Beatrice felt her chest tighten. She brushed the child's hair gently. "Why would she be mad at you, darling?" "Because she left, and I didn't say goodbye." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. It was the first time she had given voice to her guilt. Beatrice hugged her tightly, whispering words of reassurance, but inside she ached. No one had spoken to Sophia about the accident in a way she could understand. Her silence had not only been grief, but fear that she was somehow to blame. Beatrice carried this revelation to Edward later that night. He was in the study, staring at the untouched piano. "She thinks Helen is angry with her," Beatrice said. Edward stiffened, his knuckles whitening on the arm of the chair. "That's nonsense." "It isn't nonsense to her. She needs to hear from you that her mother's love never ended. That Helen didn't leave because of her." Edward rose abruptly, pacing. I don't know how to tell her that." "Then learn," Beatrice urged softly. "Because if you don't, the silence will poison her." Her words struck deep, and Edward said nothing more. The next day, Michael stumbled upon something of his own. While searching for a notebook in his father's study, he found a folder left carelessly on the desk. Inside were termination letters, 19 in total, each bearing Edward's signature. Some listed vague reasons: unsuitable, incompatible, lack of fit. Others carried curt one-line dismissals. Michael read them all, his small hands trembling. Rage flared inside him. He had suspected his father pushed everyone away, but here was proof. Cold, bureaucratic, final. When Edward entered the room moments later, Michael held the papers up, his eyes blazing. "You drove them all out," Michael accused. "Every single one." Edward froze, guilt written across his face. "They left because of you, didn't they?" Michael pressed, his voice cracking. "Not because of us. Because of you." Edward tried to speak, but Michael's voice rose, filled with years of restrained hurt. "No wonder Sophia doesn't talk. No wonder we're alone. You made it this way." The boy stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. Edward sank into his chair, shaken to the core. For the first time, the children had confronted him with the truth he had buried beneath control and excuses. Beatrice, arriving moments later, found him staring at the scattered papers, his mask broken. "They know now," she said quietly. "And maybe it's time you stop hiding from them. And from yourself." The breaking point came sooner than anyone expected. It was a golden afternoon, the kind that begged children outdoors. Michael and Sophia played reluctantly in the playground that had cost a small fortune but rarely heard laughter. Beatrice watched from the bench, her gaze soft, when Sophia climbed onto the rope structure. A sudden slip, a sharp cry. Sophia fell awkwardly, her ankle twisting beneath her. Michael rushed to her side, panicked. "Sophia." Beatrice's training came not from textbooks, but from years of lived experience. She knelt quickly, assessing. The ankle swelled, but Sophia's cries, though sharp, suggested no break. "Michael," Beatrice said firmly. "Fetch Mr. Quinn from the pharmacy. You know the way. Tell him it's urgent." Michael hesitated, fear in his eyes. "Go," Beatrice urged. "Your sister needs you." The boy ran, his legs pumping with determination. Minutes later, Jack Quinn, the neighborhood technician known for his practical knowledge, arrived with a kit. Together, he and Beatrice immobilized the ankle carefully. Edward arrived mid-chaos, his face pale. Seeing Sophia crying, a wave of terror crashed over him. For a moment he was back at the highway crash, Helen's body broken, his helplessness absolute. His knees nearly buckled. But then he saw Beatrice, calm, steady, issuing instructions with clarity. "It looks like a sprain, but she should see Dr. Henry Lewis to be sure." Edward followed every word, clinging to her composure. Within the hour, they were at the orthopedist's office. After examination and x-rays, The verdict was merciful: a simple sprain, no fracture. A brace and rest would suffice. Relief washed over Edward like a flood. As they left the clinic, Sophia clung to Beatrice, refusing to let go of her hand. Michael walked beside them, chest heaving but proud he had acted. Edward trailed behind, shaken not only by fear but by recognition. In that moment, he knew with certainty Beatrice was indispensable. Not a nanny, not a temporary figure. She had become the anchor in his children's storm. That night, after Sophia was settled into bed, Edward found himself in the music room. His hands hovered above the piano keys. He pressed one note, then another, tentative at first, then fuller. A melody emerged, broken, halting, but alive. Helen's melody, the one she used to play in the mornings. Michael crept into the room, drawn by the sound. He sat silently beside his father, listening. Slowly, Edward turned to him. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. "I thought I was protecting us by keeping things controlled. But I see now. I only locked us away." Michael swallowed hard. "Are you going to send her away too?" Edward's fingers lingered on the keys. He shook his head. "No, not this time." The boy's eyes softened, the wall between them cracking at last. Edward returned to the piano, his voice rough. "Your mother once told me not to stay alone forever. I think she knew someday someone would help us find the light again." The melody filled the room, no longer just a memory but a fragile promise. And in that moment, Edward Mason crossed the point of no return. The days following Sophia's accident unfolded with an unfamiliar rhythm in the mansion. Instead of cold silence, there was movement, interaction, and an undercurrent of fragile warmth. Sophia, confined to her bed with her ankle in a brace, became the center of attention. Beatrice remained by her side, reading stories, braiding her hair, and inventing games that could be played without standing. The little girl's mutism seemed to dissolve almost completely in Beatrice's presence. She whispered jokes, asked questions, and even sang softly when coaxed. For Edward, the experience had left a scar of terror. He replayed the moment of the fall in his mind with the same dread as the car accident years before. It had stirred in him the paralyzing fear of losing another person he loved. And yet, this time, instead of retreating, he found himself stepping closer. Each evening, he entered Sophia's room, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes silently, but always staying long enough to hold her hand. Michael observed everything. His father's attempts to return, the way Sophia's laughter crept back into the house, the steady presence of Beatrice. He admired it, yet he also feared it. Experience had taught him that nothing lasted in their home. Not the nannies, not the warmth, not even his mother. He found himself torn between cautious hope and bitter suspicion. One night, unable to sleep, Michael overheard two maids whispering in the hallway. "She won't last," one said. "None of them do. Mr. Mason will find some fault. He always does." Michael's stomach twisted. The words echoed his deepest fear. He burst into Sophia's room and shook Beatrice awake. "They think you're going to leave," he blurted out. His voice trembled with desperation. "Everyone thinks you'll go like the others." Beatrice sat up, her face calm even in the middle of the night. She reached for his shoulder. "Michael, listen to me. I am not leaving because of you or your sister. I can't promise what the future holds, but I can promise this. I'm not going anywhere by choice. Not until you want me gone." Tears stung Michael's eyes. "But what if my father—" Beatrice interrupted gently. "Your father is learning too. Give him time. And trust that I will fight to stay, if staying means helping you both heal." Michael nodded slowly, clinging to the fragile hope her words offered. Meanwhile, Edward wrestled with unexpected consequences of his own. He found himself thinking of Beatrice at odd hours, her calm tone in chaos, the way she honored Helen without fear, the steadiness she offered his children. One evening, he confessed his unease to Mrs. Constance. "I fear I'm growing dependent on her," he admitted. "Not only the children. Myself." Mrs. Constance raised an eyebrow. "And why is that a fear?" "Because if it ends, if she leaves," he faltered, unable to finish. "Then perhaps," Mrs. Constance said gently, "you should stop living as though endings are inevitable." Her words unsettled him, but they also struck true. For years, Edward had shielded himself from connection, convinced loss was the only possible outcome. But Beatrice's presence was unraveling that conviction, thread by thread. The mansion, once a mausoleum, had begun to echo with life again. And yet, with new warmth came the shadow of risk. The deeper the bond, the more painful the loss if it shattered. It was a Friday evening when Edward decided to invite Beatrice and her daughter Julia to dinner, a gesture both bold and terrifying. The staff prepared the dining room, setting the long table not for 3 lonely figures, but for 5. When Julia arrived, her 15-year-old energy filled the room with a light the mansion had not known for years. She carried her mother's resilience, but also the restless curiosity of youth. At first, Michael remained guarded, his arms crossed, his tone clipped. Sophia, however, lit up at Julia's presence. She tugged on the older girl's hand, eager to show her drawings and favorite corners of the house. Julia responded with patience, kneeling on the floor to color with Sophia while Michael watched suspiciously. During dinner, Julia spoke of school, of books she loved, of the bakery where she sometimes helped her late father's old employer. Edward listened, surprised by the ease with which she filled silence. Slowly, Michael's defenses softened. When Julia described a prank a classmate had played on a teacher, he laughed, an unguarded, boyish laugh that startled everyone at the table. Sophia clapped her hands in delight, and for a brief moment, the dining room was alive again. After dinner, as the children played board games under Julia's guidance, Edward and Beatrice stepped into the garden. "You've changed the house," Edward said quietly. "You've changed us." Beatrice shook her head. "I didn't change you. I only reminded you of what you already had." Their eyes met, and in the silence between them lay an unspoken truth. A bond had formed, fragile but undeniable. Edward remembered Helen's words from years ago, spoken one quiet night when they were still young and certain of forever. "If I'm gone someday, promise me you won't be alone forever." The memory struck him like a bell, reverberating through his chest. He had buried that promise deep, convinced it was impossible. But now, standing beside Beatrice, he felt its weight anew. Inside, Julia gathered Michael and Sophia and shared a simple metaphor. She lit a candle from the centerpiece, then handed each child a smaller candle, lighting theirs from the flame. "See," she said softly, "when you share a flame, the first one doesn't go out. It just makes the room brighter." Michael stared at the flickering light, his throat tight. Sophia whispered, "Like Mommy and Beatrice." Beatrice overheard from the doorway. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. That night, Edward lay awake, torn between memory and possibility. He thought of Helen, of her laughter and her absence, of the children's pain and their fragile hope. He thought of Beatrice's steadiness, Julia's light, the way the house seemed less like a tomb and more like a home. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by grief, but by love, love that did not erase the past, but honored it while moving forward. The buried truths had surfaced. The past was no longer a chain, but a foundation. The days after Julia's visit carried a new cadence through the mansion. Where silence once dominated, sounds of life now echoed. Sophia's soft laughter when Julia braided her hair, Michael's cautious questions about school projects, the quiet hum of Edward practicing at the piano in the evenings. For Mrs. Constance, who had endured years of cold dinners and stifled air, the change was almost miraculous. Yet with renewal came the weight of decisions. Edward knew the time had come to address what lingered unspoken between him and Beatrice. Every night, after the children were asleep, he found himself pacing the halls, restless. His feelings had grown undeniable. Gratitude had transformed into admiration, admiration into quiet longing. Still, the thought of naming it aloud filled him with dread. What if it broke the fragile peace they had built? It was Mrs. Constance who finally confronted him. She found him in the study late one night, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. "You're haunted," she said. Edward gave a tired laugh. "I've been haunted for years." "Not by Helen this time," Mrs. Constance replied. "By the possibility of something new." He turned sharply, his defenses rising. "And if it fails? If I bring someone into their lives only to lose them again? Then you will teach your children that love is worth the risk," she said firmly. "They have already learned what silence costs." Her words left no room for argument. Edward bowed his head, the weight of choice pressing harder than ever. A week later, he invited Beatrice to dinner outside the mansion. He chose the Sky Terrace, a restaurant perched high above the city, where the skyline stretched endlessly in glittering lights. It was a place he and Helen had once visited, years ago. Now, he returned with a heart heavy but hopeful. Beatrice arrived in a simple dress, her hair loosely tied, her presence unadorned yet luminous. Edward struggled to speak at first, ordering wine and forcing himself through polite conversation. Finally, as dessert arrived, he set down his fork with trembling hands. "Beatrice," he said quietly, "I need to speak honestly. For years, I've locked myself away, believing silence was safer. But since you walked into our lives, everything has shifted. The children are healing, and so am I. What I feel for you is more than gratitude." Beatrice listened, her gaze steady. Edward continued, his voice low but firm. "I don't want to rush. I don't want to risk hurting Michael and Sophia. But I also cannot deny what's in my heart. I want us to move forward, carefully, responsibly, but together, if you'll allow it." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Edward feared he had spoken too soon. But then Beatrice reached across the table, her hand resting gently over his. "I've lost too, Edward," she said softly. "I know what it means to fear love because it might end. But I've also learned that when love is true, it multiplies instead of replaces. I will move carefully too, for Julia, for Michael, for Sophia. But yes, I will walk forward with you." Relief flooded him, mingled with awe. The city lights glittered like 1,000 promises beyond the glass. And for the first time since Helen's death, Edward allowed himself to hope not just for survival, but for joy. Spring deepened into summer, and with it came a new sense of balance within the Mason household. Edward returned from work earlier, often in time for family dinners that no longer felt like rituals of obligation, but like evenings of connection. He played the piano more often, coaxing Sophia to hum along, sometimes persuading Michael to press keys with him. Julia became a frequent visitor, her bond with Michael strengthening through shared games and quiet confidences. But with growth came the need for definition. The children began to sense the unspoken bond between their father and Beatrice. Michael, ever perceptive, grew restless, torn between loyalty to his mother's memory and gratitude toward Beatrice's presence. Sophia, younger but intuitive, clung to Beatrice with increasing affection, as though fearing she might vanish like the others. One evening, after the children were asleep, Edward sat with Mrs. Constance in the kitchen. "They deserve to know," she said bluntly. "Children see more than we admit. If you keep them in the dark, they'll imagine worse truths than the real one." Edward nodded slowly. The decision crystallized within him. It was time. 2 days later, he called Michael and Sophia into the garden. Beatrice stood nearby, uncertain, while Julia held Sophia's hand. The late afternoon sun bathed the garden in gold, roses blooming in careful rows. Edward's heart thundered as he faced his children. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice thick. "When your mother passed, I promised myself I would never let anyone else close. I thought I was protecting you, but I was only closing us off from life. Then Beatrice came into our lives. She has cared for you, for me, with patience and love. I care for her deeply. More than that, I love her." Michael's eyes widened. He clenched his fists, struggling with emotions he could not contain. "But what about Mom?" he cried. "Doesn't that mean you've forgotten her?" Edward knelt before his son, his own eyes brimming. "No, Michael, I could never forget her. Loving Beatrice does not mean loving your mother less. It means honoring her wish that we not stay in sorrow forever. Love is not a candle that burns out when you light another. It's a flame that spreads and makes the world brighter." Sophia whispered, echoing Julia's earlier metaphor, "like the candles." Michael's face crumpled. He threw his arms around his father's neck, sobbing. Sophia followed, her small arms wrapping them both. Beatrice stood frozen, her own tears falling silently, until Julia nudged her forward. She stepped closer, joining the embrace, forming a circle of trembling bodies and unspoken vows. In that moment, the truth was no longer hidden. The family had crossed the threshold together, fragile but united. The moment of truth had come, and instead of shattering them, it bound them tighter. The weeks following the garden revelation unfolded with a gentleness none of them could have predicted. What had once been a house steeped in grief began to bloom into something resembling a home again. Morning light seemed warmer, laughter echoed in halls long accustomed to silence, and even the staff, once skeptical, moved with renewed energy. The change was undeniable. Edward, once a figure of ice and distance, now carried a softened presence. He returned earlier from work, choosing family dinners over endless business meetings. Sometimes he even arrived in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, attempting clumsy efforts to help Beatrice or Mrs. Constance prepare meals. His children watched in astonishment as their father, who once ruled the house with silence and discipline, laughed at himself while burning toast or spilling flour. Sophia's transformation was perhaps the most striking. The little girl who had hidden behind mutism now spoke freely to Beatrice, Julia, and even her teachers at school. She still carried shyness, but no longer the paralyzing silence that had gripped her for years. Her drawings, once filled with shadows and empty chairs, now depicted gardens, smiling faces, and stars that shone above rooftops. Michael, too, began to shed the armor of severity. He played soccer in the garden with Julia, challenging her with laughter instead of retreating into solitude. He even dared to ask his father for help on a school project, a request Edward nearly wept at fulfilling. One Saturday, Edward suggested something bold, a family outing. They went to the park together, Beatrice and Julia walking beside them. And for the first time, Edward did not worry about appearances or whispered judgments. He pushed Sophia on the swings, raced Michael across the field, and sat with Beatrice on a bench while Julia helped the children with kites. Watching the colorful fabrics soar into the sky, Edward realized how much he had missed by clinging to his grief. The next step came quietly, but deliberately. Edward gathered Michael and Sophia one evening in the garden, just as twilight painted the sky in lavender hues. He held their hands, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "There's something important I want to ask," he said, "but I can't do it without you." Beatrice stood nearby, uncertain, until Edward turned toward her. "These children are my world," he said softly, "and they are part of this question. I don't want to move forward unless they are with me." Michael's eyes widened as his father handed him a single rose. Sophia received another. Together, they walked toward Beatrice, their small hands trembling but determined. "Beatrice," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly, "will you marry our dad?" Sophia held out her rose, whispering, "Please." Tears streamed down Beatrice's face as she knelt, gathering the children into her arms. She looked up at Edward, her voice trembling but clear. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." The garden erupted in applause from Mrs. Constance and the staff who had gathered discreetly nearby. Even the walls of the mansion seemed to exhale, as though the house itself recognized its rebirth. The wedding was simple, held in the small church where Beatrice and Julia had found solace for years. Edward wore a tailored suit, Michael a miniature version of it, Sophia a white dress dotted with flowers. Beatrice walked down the aisle holding Julia's hand, her eyes never leaving Edward's. When the vows were spoken, there was no grandeur, no excess, only sincerity and tears of gratitude. In the pews, Mrs. Constance wept openly. She had prayed for this moment, and now it unfolded before her eyes. A family not erased by tragedy, but rebuilt by love. Their honeymoon was not a luxurious escape to Europe or an exotic island. Instead, Edward chose something far more meaningful, a family trip to Disney, something Helen had once dreamed of taking the children to. For Michael and Sophia, the trip was pure wonder, rides, parades, laughter, and moments of unburdened joy. Edward and Beatrice watched them with awe, their hearts full, knowing this was the future Helen would have wanted, her children smiling, her husband learning to live again. Back in Sao Paulo, the mansion no longer felt like a monument to loss. The piano was played daily, sometimes by Edward, sometimes by Michael, and often with Sophia humming along. The kitchen, once pristine and silent, now carried the smell of flour and sugar as Beatrice and the children baked powder at Cucar together. Julia, bright and steady, became like an older sister to Michael and Sophia, her laughter filling the corridors with music of its own. One evening, as Edward stood in the kitchen doorway, he watched the scene before him. Sophia sprinkling sugar too generously, Michael trying to knead dough with Julia's guidance, Beatrice laughing as she corrected them. The room was alive, warm, imperfectly perfect. Edward stepped closer, resting his hands on the counter, and whispered almost to himself, Miracles don't come with grandeur. They come disguised as simple people who choose to love. Beatrice looked up, meeting his eyes. She smiled, flower on her cheek, and in that moment Edward knew. The house had become a home again. The portrait of Helen still hung above the mantel, her smile eternal, her presence honored. But now, her memory was no longer a weight of sorrow. It was a blessing, a flame that had lit the path toward healing. The Mason family, once broken, had been remade, not in the absence of grief, but in the presence of hope. And as music and laughter filled the halls, the mansion stood not as a mausoleum of loss, but as a testament to love's power to resurrect. If you made it this far, leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from today and what you thought of the story. If you can, share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to receive new videos. A big hug, and see you tomorrow.